Emily, thank you so much for joining us today in Voice of the Champions. You are our champion today as a global voice and leader in menstrual hygiene, in women's health. I mean, I am such a fan of the work that you've been doing. We've been corresponding for a little bit now, obviously, before we met in this session, and I'm completely blown away by the work that you're doing. So I appreciate you taking the time today to join us in this series and just share your wisdom, your thoughts, and the impact that your work has been doing on the ground. I hope you are well today. I'm going to jump straight into question one and ask you, who is Emily and why are you so passionate about women's health issues?
Great, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and really thrilled to be part of the conversations you're having about these important issues. I'm the CEO and founder at Iris International. We're building a world where a female body isn't a disadvantage. And I think for me, just slowly over my life, I've started to realize how the way that our societies are structured across the world interact with having a female body to create significant disadvantage and barriers to young women realizing their full potential. And that creates a vicious cycle where young women fail to realize their full potential as leaders, and then we get these leadership structures that fail to meet their needs. So we create this cycle of disadvantage. And that manifests in multiple different ways, from girls missing school because they don't have menstrual pads, to chronic lack of research into menstrual specific disorders. So it manifests in all these different ways, but I think at the root of it is this kind of systematic bias against the female body. And at iRise, we're really passionate about breaking that cycle and turning it into a cycle of empowerment.
I actually love that so much because I mean today, your talk is titled Period Poverty is About Power, right? And I want to talk about that. What does that mean for you? You've mentioned like the barriers that women face, because of their bodies. But what does that mean to give women power back in their period?
So I think if we think about period poverty, I mean, what you have is this very kind of basic biological need that is experienced by a large part of the population, that has been historically experienced by a large part of humanity. And yet we've managed to build our world and structure our society in such a way that it's overlooked. It becomes a massive obstacle. It's very hidden. And I think we have to ask ourselves why, because it shouldn't, when you stop to think about it, it obviously shouldn't be that way. Like something that, happens every month for so many people shouldn't be so hidden and shouldn't be such a disadvantage. And I think if we ask why, I think it becomes clear that it's because historically and today in decision-making spaces, there is a lack of diverse female leadership. And I think the diverse part of that is really important because it's not just about women leaders, it's about people, it's that diversity of experience. So women who have grown up in different contexts, people who've had a variety of experiences, that is lacking from our leadership spaces. Like they tend to be groups of very similar people with very similar experience. And what that does is it means that critical experiences and insights get overlooked, and then we get decisions that create these massive oversights, these massive biases that hold whole swathes of the world back. And so that, I suppose that's what we mean when we say it's about power. We mean the root cause here is actually if we had diverse female leadership in these spaces, we wouldn't have to go and tackle each of these issues separately. We wouldn't have to go and be like, okay, let's tackle period poverty. Let's tackle the issues with endometriosis in the UK. It takes 8 years to get a diagnosis in the UK. Like we wouldn't have to go and pick all these little issues out. We would, because they would be routinely understood and addressed in how we structure our world. And so when we talk about power, I think we see period poverty and the issues related to period poverty as, I suppose, a manifestation of this deeper power imbalance, but also a way to break it. So actually, if you can give girls what they need when they start their period, you're basically saying to them, like, you matter, your experiences matter, and that empowers them to break this cycle, to actually realize their full potential, become leaders, and be that diverse female voice that we're seriously lacking. And so I suppose, for us, period poverty it is about power. It's a manifestation of a power imbalance, but it's also this critical button that we can push to break that cycle and to get young women and girls into leadership spaces, to help them realize their full potential, because it's something you do so early in their life, when it's a way of, at that critical moment when society starts to say, this is what being a woman means, this is, you start your period, you're ready for womanhood and all the things it entails. Projects and initiatives to address period poverty, they give a different message. They say, actually, you really matter, your needs matter, and actually you can be you. You don't need to be a woman, you're more than that, you can be you. And I think that's the power. It's coming in at that point and saying, there's a different way, there's a different path for you, and you can take that path, and it's a path to power. So yeah, I think that's what we mean by period poverty is about power.
I love that last line that you just said, that it's a path to power. I mean, as you were talking and you were just explaining the link between period poverty and power and empowerment, but also the importance of the conversation, right? You mentioned how when a girl first goes on her cycle, the conversation is all about how now you're a woman now, right? You're a woman now and you can go out and do womanly things. And that doesn't necessarily leave us feeling very good. I mean, I know for myself personally, so I experienced sexual trauma very young in my life. And then again, when I was a teenager. And for me, getting my cycle frightened me completely, because the thing that I was running away from, I wasn't trying to be seen as a woman. I wasn't trying to be seen as ready. In our culture, there's a saying in my language, and it's "Ke a go godisa." And what that basically means, it's men, older boys, men in the community who will kind of look at little girls around and say, I pick you. So I'm choosing you and I'm raising you and I'm going to keep my eye on you. And as soon as you become a woman, then I will make you mine. So for me, like my cycle and going on it was a terrifying experience. And to keep hearing that you will be a woman once you go in your cycle. And then so for me, that link just meant, oh my gosh, does that mean I'm going to be grown? I'm going to be ready? Am I basically like pruned now? And it was a terrifying thing. And I think it's important that you're saying we need to change the narrative and change the conversation so that it's not just about being a woman or just your anatomy, but more of a empowerment one. And I don't know, how do we do that? How are we going to start to do that? Your work does a lot. Your foundation does a lot of work in that. And I think perhaps then we need to maybe look at, what does period poverty actually mean? And how does that equate to period inequality as well, especially for the guys that are listening right now and watching this at home who are new to these kind of terminologies that you are using. Do you maybe just want to expand that for us a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a lot of different terminology used, and I think as a sector we haven't really defined it all that well. But I'll talk you through kind of what I mean. So I think period poverty and shame has been widely used to talk about this lack of access to menstrual products, and people have added shame onto it, in recognition that it is about much more than products. Like, you can give girls products, but actually if there's still a lot of shame, those products won't equal freedom, because girls won't be able to use them safely, comfortably. So I think that's period poverty and shame. There's been a real focus on that. I think what iRise has done is we went through an exercise where we spoke to young women and girls and other young advocates across the context where we work, so in the UK and East Africa, and also beyond that, about how their understanding of kind of why they were part of the menstrual, the period movement, what it was that they thought was holding them back. And what came out of that was this much more complex idea, which links back to what we were talking about at the beginning, about how the female body kind of interacts with these societal structures and norms to create disadvantage. And what we came out with was almost this like period equality flower, where you've got these multiple domains of young women's lives, where this kind of interaction between their biology and the choices their society have made create barriers. And just to kind of talk through some of them, so you've got access to education, where a lot of young women and girls are struggling to participate in school because of lack of products, but also lack of appropriate facilities and support in the school environment. You've got access to employment, so similar challenges kind of follow young women into the workplace. You've got the kind of, I suppose, the most obvious manifestation around just this simple lack of access to sanitation and kind of gender sensitive wash. So yeah, water, sanitation, hygiene side of things. And I think within that, what came out very strongly is it's not about expensive innovation. It's really about privacy and safety. And actually a lot of women around the world just do not feel safe when they change their menstrual materials. Like they fear that they will come to harm because their menstrual status is known. So that whole kind of very kind of, I suppose, most obvious area. But then there's other areas as well. So there's leadership and power, which I think links back to the root cause of this issue, that actually, you know, then young women don't feel heard, like they don't feel that their needs are being considered, and that kind of perpetuates this whole cycle. There's also safety. So a lot of young activists talk to us about how they period poverty and the kind of the tension in households where women are asking for additional resources to meet their sort of female specific needs. That's often a trigger for domestic violence. And we've just been talking about how some of the harmful social norms around starting your period can lead to harm. So you gave the example of young kind of girls almost being groomed to become you know, wives or sexually active, or to fulfill this kind of preconceived role around womanhood. And I think we've seen similar things in other contexts. So in Uganda, I think there's a lot of pressure for girls to marry once they start their periods in certain communities. There's also pressures to undergo female genital cutting in some contexts. So there's all these kind of harms that jeopardize young women's safety, also linked to this same interaction. And so when we talk about period equality, what we really mean progress across all these areas where the interaction between the female body and society creates disadvantage. And I suppose, and we're really focusing on where that's a choice, because I think if it's a choice, it's an injustice. Like if our societies and our governments are choosing to structure things in a way that creates this very real harm in young women's lives, where their bodies are kind of experiencing violence and harm because of these decisions, like that's an injustice. And so for us, period equality is progress across this framework, where actually the end result is a society where a female body is not a disadvantage, and that needs like policy action across those different areas. And I think most importantly, you were asking, how do we do this? Like, how do we kind of solve this problem? And I think the critical thing is because it's about power, the voices of those affected have got to be at the center. So you've got to have everything that we do has got to enable their leadership and voice. Otherwise, you're just kind of putting a plaster on the wound rather than kind of really enabling a sort of a healing process, I suppose. So that, I suppose, that's our kind of how we understand the problem and what we're really pushing governments for. You know, it's not just pads, it's power. It's actually, we want considered, careful policy action across these different domains of women and girls' lives that remove the disadvantage created by the female body, and that we see that as a form of justice for women.
That is powerful. I think just that entire process, your understanding of period poverty, but also period inequality, right? And I think it's one of those things where you're making us fully comprehend the magnitude of the issue. I think your answer was so complete and so holistic that we're starting to get a better understanding of the consequences of period poverty and period inequality. And I like the fact that you also brought into your answer, how do we then start to change these things? But one thing that stood out for me as you were talking was the association of periods with privacy and safety. And I think the reason why that stood out for me was because, we live in a world where there's so much taboo and so much stigma associated with when a woman goes on her menstrual cycle, right? It was actually recently shared to me that the word taboo is actually a Polynesian word, tapua, I hope I'm saying it right. And that's the origin. And with that word, it actually meant something sacred, which was something that was not to be touched, but not in a bad way. It was supposed to be in a way to honor women during that time, right? To say this is a sensitive time for her and whatever the case may be. And now you mentioned privacy and safety. You said, in a lot of the regions where you guys are doing your work, it's about they're not even feeling safe in changing their menstrual products because they fear getting attacked. And I find that so strange and so incomprehensible, because in my culture, the taboo is you don't touch a woman when she's bleeding. She's considered filthy. She's considered unclean. In some places, you can't sleep if you share sort of a room with other kids. You can't sleep with them. So it's a complete isolation from them. It baffles my mind that there could be other cultures or other spaces where men see this as a vulnerable time for young girls. What has been that experience like in the places that you're working?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the harms that people are afraid of vary. So I think in some contexts it is this fear of ridicule. So I know in a lot of schools there's this real fear that the boys will. I mean, they often do kind of go into the
Yeah,
toilets. The toilets aren't very private, and so there's this fear of kind of ridicule, bullying, harassment, and kind of being excluded from school because your menstrual status is known. I think in other contexts there is a fear of rape and sexual violence. That
yeah,
actually you're because you're having to if you don't have safe facilities, you're having to go out into the community to use communal facilities
that makes
or
sense.
yeah, so there's this kind of I suppose you're putting yourself in a risky situation because you're having to go out and do something
And often
quite
alone.
vulnerable. Yes, on your own, exactly, because it's taboo and because it's private as well. I think that makes it even more kind of actually you're doing it in secret. You're trying to hide it from your family often if you're young and you don't want to be seen as ready to marry. Like there's a lot in
Yeah,
a lot of the girls we talk to, they try and keep it secret for as long as possible. So you're going off into a public space to do something secret, and so you're creating this opportunity for sexual exploitation and sexual violence. And then I think the other aspect as well is that a lot of the contexts where we work, the extra costs of a female body do put a strain on the household. And I think we see that women's power is intrinsically linked to economic empowerment. And actually a lot of these young women, that their families, their households don't necessarily want to allocate those extra resources to menstrual products, to soap, to the additional things they need as a young woman, or they're not able to. And so there's also this kind of economic pressure, and that forces girls into transactional sex, so into relationships to meet those basic needs. And it sounds, people often say to me, oh, but sex with pads, like it sounds really kind of ridiculous and out
yes,
there. But I suppose when you understand the context, it really isn't, because it's basically it's the needs that the family see as adult needs that
yes,
should be, I suppose, either met by the individual or by the partner. And so
yeah,
these kind of teenage girls, the message they're getting from often from their parents is actually, you're a big girl now, like you should bring in your own income, you should
yeah,
meet these needs. And actually then they're faced with, well, how do we do that? And actually there's often they end up in these relationships where they're
yeah.
having sex in
Because
exchange for these
that's what
basic.
they have, because their
Yeah.
bodies is what they have. And that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, part of the work that I do outside of the foundation is based on that, right? For me, education is key to economic freedom, to financial freedom. We see it, I mean, when I was in high school as well, and we did outreach programs, we would give care packets, right? And in the care packets, and we realized that, okay, but these kids are not necessarily doing any better even with the monthly care packages. And we would have conversations with them to say what is actually happening. And you'll find that in these households, because there's so many people in certain family structures, there might be so many people that they're actually not getting to use the menstrual hygiene products that we were provided, the cleaning products like you mentioned that were provided in the care packages. So that's another concern, and I'm so glad you brought that into the conversation. But even more of a concern is that because it's seen as an adult need, it's like now you are a grown person, you can go do that. It's forcing young girls to start using their bodies in a way that they really shouldn't be at that point in their time, at that age in their time. And I think that connection then to it's such an incredible cycle that you've just mentioned. Now you've taken me on a completely different whirlwind in my mind as you were talking, in terms of all of the consequences that this is, that it's not even just about the consequences of keeping a girl in school and making sure that she's able to, during this period, to stay in school. What is that? How important is it to keep them in school and to give them the choice of product and to give them correct sanitation? You mentioned with your period flower that there's so many different aspects of it that you guys deal with. But I think let's just maybe bring it a little closer. Let's just condense it a little bit and talk specifically to their schooling experience. The consequence of not having what they need to stay in school, you mentioned, is just such a ripple effect. And being able to solve that, right? Would that make a significant impact in the choices that they're making now? It makes me so sad to think, actually, that there are young girls out there who are exchanging sex just for menstrual products. I mean, I've known of girls in high school who are exchanging sex for clothes and for food. And I don't think that's a world that we want to live in. And I love the fact that you guys' work is so centered around empowerment and around leadership and understanding all the aspects that are involved in that. So please just maybe talk us through that again in terms of keeping girls in school. What is the positive impact of doing that in terms of menstrual hygiene and menstrual products?
Yeah, so I think what needs to be recognized is that period work is a really powerful upstream measure to keep girls in school. And I think there is this big body of evidence. We know if girls stay in school, they marry later, they have fewer children, they earn more economically, and those benefits are felt by their whole community. And actually, we know that in many of these contexts, it is the economic empowerment that is critical to the leadership. Like these young women, they're not going to be able to participate in decision making processes without their own economic resources. It's a prerequisite really of that social kind of political participation. So I think we know that actually if we get them on this journey, they have these substantially better outcomes. And I think what needs to be recognized is that actually this period equality is a prerequisite for going on that journey, really. Like with it's a very kind of fundamental need. And I think it's recognizing it's not this add-on, it's a fundamental kind of shift in how we think about that adolescent girl's journey, because it's basically breaking that link between her body and disadvantage. And I suppose you can, and I think many of us share that experience and carry that disadvantage with us throughout. I share that in different ways, to a different extreme, but I also in my own life share that sense that I'm carrying that disadvantage. And I think it's breaking that link and saying actually your body is not going to be a disadvantage for you, and actually that's going to accelerate that whole journey. And I think the other thing to recognize is because it's linked to all these other areas, you're actually catalyzing progress across the board. So if you look at the SDGs, I think period inequality, kind of as we define it, is a bottleneck across many of these goals. Like even if we take gender-based violence, which I think we've been talking about and has so much focus, I think we need to recognize that period poverty and shame, it's a form of violence against women. We talk about slow violence, where actually when your society systematically undermines your needs and fails to recognize your needs, that it's kind of subtle, but it's a form of violence. And actually for many of these girls, it does result in direct kind of sexual violence, sexual exploitation. So recognizing it as a powerful, neglected kind of, I suppose, bottleneck in all these different issues that we know are holding girls back, a meaning that they either drop out of school or don't do as well in school as they could do. I think this issue, this intersection between the body and society, is the bottleneck. And I know that recently at the Generation Equality Forum, I think the Secretary General of the UN, he was talking about how we are stalling with gender equality. Like if you look at the kind of index for gender equality, like we've actually gone backwards over the last kind of few years. Like we're not making the progress that we want. And I think the UN have, and they brought out their first kind of social norm index, and they basically said, look, we're making good progress when it's basic participation, but when it comes to empowerment, genuine empowerment, we're hitting a brick wall. And he was basically saying at the Generation Equality Forum, the reason is that power has to be taken. Like power is never given, it has to be taken. And I think if we want young women and girls to take power, this is the catalyst. Like we've got to kind of break this link between their bodies and disadvantage, and put them on this journey, this, like we say, this path to power. And I think that's what the period equality movement is about. That's why people are so passionate about it, because it's putting girls on this path to power. And that's what we're missing in gender equality work. We're too focused on participation, and actually this kind of work, it's a different path. It puts them on a path to power. And I think education, like you said, is a critical part of that path. Right. But it's a long journey.
it's like starting from the beginning, right? It's like actually doing a root cause analysis and trying to really figure out where does it all start, right? Not looking at possibly the symptoms of it or like all the consequences, but really looking at where does it start. And I think it's important that you mention that, right? The path to power actually starts at adolescence, when a woman's body starts to change and our anatomy starts to change, and all of a sudden we have this additional thing that we need to deal with that will change the trajectory of our life, right? That will change. If we can't stay in school, if we can't complete schooling, it completely changes the potential, the opportunities that we have available to us. But I also love that you mentioned the word violence. And I suppose not because of the definition of violence, but I think it's important because that is such a strong word. It's such a strong word, and perhaps anybody watching today might sit there going, "That was a bit strong. Was that not a bit dramatic to call this violence against women, against girls? Because there is no physical, it isn't a physical contact. It's, hey, a girl's going on her period. What's so bad about that if there's no policies in place? What's so bad about that if there's no support? What's so terrible about that, if she doesn't have access to choice of menstrual hygiene products?" And so I think let's talk a little bit more then about the kind of work that you would like to see instituted, or perhaps a lot more work done in terms of policy. What should sort of governments and communities be doing on a policy level to ensure that there is a path to power for every girl that's going through the system?
So I think mechanisms to hear girls' voices has got to be kind of right at the top of my list. And I think that can be very simple things like girls' clubs in schools. But actually, I think that act of bringing girls and young women together and giving them a space where they can talk about their priorities, and those priorities can feed into the decision-making structures that affect their lives. And I think that's true across the context where we work. Like, we're lacking those mechanisms. Like, that's as true in the UK as it is in Uganda. Like, the young women I work with in the UK, they feel politically disenfranchised. Like, they feel that
Yes.
there's no mechanism for their unique voice experiences and needs to be heard, and they don't feel represented by the people in power. Even when there are women, like, there are no young women, there are no people at there with their experience. So I think creating these mechanisms where those voice and experience can feed directly into decision making, and I think in Uganda for us at the moment that's girls' clubs, but it can be there's many different mechanisms across the context where we work. So I think that's kind of number one. I think number two has got to be, I haven't really touched on this, but I think it's a really important part of this cycle of disempowerment, is that it's production of knowledge and learning. So I think what we learn about, what we research, what we choose to understand is all shaped by the people in power. So so our leadership totally sort of sets the agenda. And so I think we need to consciously invest in these overlooked areas, because if you look at the current spending, a fraction of the global investment goes in these kind of into these issues, into women's health issues, into women's rights issues, and an even smaller percentage actually gets into the hands of women themselves. So I think we've got to change that investment and tackle this knowledge issue, because I think we know knowledge is power, and actually at the moment we just know so little about the female body. And so I think investment in the knowledge gap and the data bias around the female body. So they would be kind of my two top things. And then I think the third one, I think there's got to be, I think at the moment we're in a situation where the grassroots and communities are really kind of standing by young women and girls, particularly through the pandemic. Like, they've been the ones to step up and offer this safety net for vulnerable girls and young women. I think governments have largely failed them. I think there's been a real absence of gender sensitive policy. There's been and a lot of the response has actually kind of pushed girls into much more vulnerable situations than was necessary. And actually what we've seen is it's the grassroots, the community-based organizations stepping up. And so I think in the short term, we need to really invest in those spaces where spaces that are already supporting girls, that know how to do it, that are already listening to their voices. Invest in those spaces so that governments can actually learn how to do this, like what works, what do girls need, because at the moment that gap between government and your young woman experiencing this is so vast, and the girls and young women feel that vastness. They feel this gap, and it makes them feel hopeless. And so I think investing in the organizations that know them best will help to close that gap, and that will lead to governments understanding girls' needs better. So they would be my kind of top three, I think.
And I mean, hey, and you guys are actually doing that right now in your organization, iRise, right? You're trying to develop leadership in these girls. You're creating voices, like a community of voices, so that they can share that and they can trickle it upwards, right? We're trying to go upstream so that we can get our voices and so the government and policymakers can understand. It actually reminds me of a picture a couple of years ago. I think it was maybe 5 years ago. There was a picture of a parliament room, I think it was in the UAE, and they were busy discussing breastfeeding issues for women. So when should a woman stop breastfeeding? Because the big issue back then was that it was compulsory for a woman to breastfeed a child until at least 6 months. So the woman had no choice. This was law. So they were sitting in parliament to now discuss this law and whether or not it needs to be changed. And there wasn't a single woman in the room to have that discussion. And I think it's important that you're saying that, to say we need to get more voices in a room that actually understand period poverty and period inequality and the systematic effect of these young girls not being allowed to stay in school, the systematic effect of the menstrual cycle on the entire system and on the entire journey that a woman goes through. So I think that is absolutely amazing. And I applaud you guys for that work that you're doing. Do keep at it, guys. I mean, we will definitely raise our hands and say, come and give our girls workshops and lessons as well in this and how they can empower themselves, you know, almost to say, despite their period. That should not even be a factor. It's you have the potential and you have the power to do and to be anything that you want to be. I think just in closing then, Emily, my question to you would be, you know, period freedom, right? That's what we're essentially trying to create with our foundation as well, is and regardless, it's a choice matter. We completely understand that. But we're saying we are trying to keep 1 million girls in school and to do that in a sustainable way and to perhaps do it in a way that is not necessarily seen as conventional, is not necessarily seen as normal to do in our communities. And we know a lot of education is going to be required for that. But how important is it for any girl to have that period freedom, to not have to worry about where am I going to get my next menstrual hygiene products from? Will I be able to stay in school this month? Am I going to be able to write my exams? And we're trying to create that. We're trying to say we want to gift you with that. And obviously, our solution is menstrual cups, but we understand that there is choice in that too. So regardless of whether you're using pads or tampons or menstrual cups, but the point is we're trying to spread period freedom. And I'm sure that's what your organization is also striving for in the world. And like, how much does that drive you to see women in the world living in a period positive world and not having to worry about that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see that world like within a generation. And I actually do believe it's possible. Like, I think the new generation are different than any generation that has gone before. I think they're more connected via social media, via technology than any other generation. I think that amplifies their power significantly because they're not on their own feeling frustrated. They, through technology, they connect with other young women and girls, and this kind of, these frustrations, they become this kind of manifesto for change. And I think that's what we see in the period equality movement and in our work, this kind of this grassroots kind of next generation of young women kind of rising up and basically saying, actually, this is what we want. And because of the way the world has changed, it's so much harder to ignore them. And so I feel really hopeful actually that this, in a generation, we can see significant difference, because actually they can break the stigma. That's certainly one that can be done in a generation. Like, they can break the stigma, they can kind of end the shame by talking about it, and no one can stop them doing that. And I think once they've done that, everything else will follow. So I feel hopeful that we can see kind of significant progress towards period equality kind of by 2030, like through this new generation of activists and advocates.
We are absolutely hopeful too. And I think just before we close the session with you, I'm going to just ask you to maybe let people know who's ever watching or listening to this, how they can get a hold of you, how they can be in support of the work you're doing, and in the, you know, in the work. Can they contact you on LinkedIn? Is there a website perhaps? I'll also make sure that I just list everything as well when I upload this video so they have it. But please do share your contact details with everyone, Emily.
Sure. So I think the best way to find out more is our website, which is www.irise.org.uk. So that's IRISE. And if you go on there, you can find we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Instagram. I think we're on TikTok, although I don't really understand TikTok. So yeah, you can find kind of all about us through there. I think there's loads of ways to get involved. Like, we are a community, so we have a global mentorship circle for kind of up and coming young leaders, which is open to anyone who's kind of interested in our work. We also have the Period Equality Network in East Africa and beyond for grassroots groups, individuals who are working on this issue. And in the UK, we have a similar network called the Empower Period Network. So I think if you feel passionate, like, and you want to get more involved, kind of, you can join our community. But definitely kind of follow us on social media, and we'd love to kind of keep you updated on kind of what we do. And I think for us, we really believe in the movement, in collaboration, in being more powerful together. So we welcome anyone to connect with us and kind of become part of the movement kind of with us.
I cannot add or take away any more than what you've said, Emily. Thank you so much for a fantastic conversation with you. It was absolutely amazing just getting to pick your brain a little bit in the session and to have like uninterrupted sort of one-on-one time with you. It has been an absolute honor. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been really interesting. I've absolutely loved it.
Thank you for watching this episode of our series, The Voice of Champions. If you also want to make an impact and become a Million Girls Champion, then visit our website at amilliongirlsfoundation.org and help us keep a million girls in school.